Fabulous. Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. So my greetings to the colleagues of the Sufi Studies Network and distinguished guests, and of course our speaker for today. This is our sixth meeting, and I will be your moderator. And I would like to say it's an absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Raphael Dascalu. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If I don't, please do correct me. A little bit about Dr. Dascalu. He was born and raised in Sydney. He completed his MA at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and his PhD at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on Jewish intellectual culture in the late medieval period, with a focus on the reception of Islamic philosophy and mysticism among Jews. Dr. Dascalu is currently an adjunct research associate at Monash University and coordinator of the Jewish Muslim Forum at Monash. Dr. Dascalu is the author of a book titled A Philosopher of Scripture, published by Brill in 2019, and which is an intellectual portrait of, and I hope I pronounced this properly, Tanhum ha-Yerushalmi.
That was excellent.
Oh, thank you. A late medieval Jewish linguist and philologist, philosopher, and mystic. The title of his talk today will be Jewish Encounters with Sufism in the late medieval period. He will deliver a 30-minute talk. Afterwards, we will stop recording and we'll have about 20 minutes of unrecorded conversation, or Q&A, question and answer session. And then, if I may ask for all participants to please use the raise your hand function, which is at the bottom of the window, so that I could see your hand and I can bring my attention to you. And also, if you like, you may post a question in the chat box, and then I will get to that as we go along. So thank you so much for joining us. And dear Dr. Dascalu, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure and an honor. Thank you. I'll share screen if that's all right, yes. and dive in. These are some simple slides to just put a bit of data up in front of us so that we can look at it in very general terms while we travel through what might be unfamiliar territory for most. I think it's I'll just work this out. Okay. So is everybody seeing the slides? Okay. So to begin, today we're going to be exploring Jewish encounters with Sufism in the late medieval period, and we'll begin with a little bit of background, which is in particular the major cultural shift that occurs with the early Islamic conquest. Basically, that Jewish communities that had lived in Byzantium or under Byzantine rule and Sasanian rule find themselves under Islamic rule, and where in the earlier period, under Byzantine and Sasanian rule, Jews did not really participate directly in the dominant intellectual cultures of the ruling society. That they did participate in many ways in the dominant culture, of course, and that's been widely studied. But in terms of literary corpora, they didn't participate very directly in that period, in preceding the early Islamic conquest. And what that meant was that the literature that they produced and the intellectual discourse in which they engaged was very different from those of the ruling societies, of the dominant societies. Now that shift in the first centuries following the early Islamic conquests, and we see that Jews are participating directly in the dominant intellectual cultures and are consuming and engaging with the same literary corpora and producing the producing literature in the dominant literary genres of the dominant cultural milieu. So that includes commentaries, philosophical treatises, thematic legal monographs, grammatical works, and they're mostly written in judeo-arabic. So written in Arabic, in Hebrew letters, and depending on the genre, with varying amounts of the genre and the writer, and various quantities of code switching, meaning of Hebrew and Aramaic vocabulary. So that's the sort of the new literary situation among the Jews of the Islamic world. This doesn't occur to the same degree in the Latin West until much later, and to a much lesser degree. And so we can trace from about the 10th century. We can see that in the Mashriq, in the Islamic East, Jewish literary production is largely shaped by kalam, by systematic theology, although it's more eclectic than that. But that's a major component of Jewish intellectual discourse in the Mashriq. Where in the Maghrib, it tends to be more shaped by Neoplatonic sources, such as Al-Kindi and Ikhwan al-Safa and various other pseudo-Jahiz. And so we can see that there's a different intellectual climate in the East and West sort of reaches of the Islamic world. Now, in this period before Maimonides, and we'll talk about why Maimonides is important, but in this period before the late 12th century, there's only one writer that we can really point to, one Jewish author who engages with Sufi material, and that is Bahya ibn Paquda of Saragossa, so an Andalusian Jewish author who engages with Sufi sources alongside Neoplatonic sources and a range of literature. We won't talk about him too much because it's really the late medieval period that I think is fascinating. Although Bahya ibn Paquda, although his one major work, The Guide to the Duties of the Heart, remains very important in Jewish intellectual life to the present, actually, in its Hebrew translation. It was written in Judeo-Arabic. That Sufi strand, or that direct engagement with Sufi literature, at least, wasn't really continued in a meaningful way until a later period. It was really picked up at a later. That thread was picked up at a later period. So we'll move on to Maimonides. Now, Moses Maimonides, the world changes. Jewish intellectual culture really shifts with the activities of Maimonides. He was a refugee from Almohad al-Andalus to Fatimid Egypt, so he fled the less tolerant territories of Almohad rule to Fatimid Egypt, and he seems really in Jewish, Muslim, and Christian intellectual culture. He occupies quite a different place. He's remembered among more traditional Jews as a jurist. I think in Islamic tradition, more as part of a very rich medical tradition, and in the Latin tradition as a philosopher through the scholastics. And really, he was all of those things, and he composed works in all of those fields. And he composed all of them except for his medical works, and one possible small exception, but that's a small, complicated exception. But basically, all of his works except for his medical works in Judeo-Arabic, so in Hebrew script, with quite a large Hebrew component and Aramaic component. But his medical works he composed for a general readership, and he engaged very directly in the Aristotelian or in the Peripatetic tradition. And among other things, although he tends to align more with the Al-Farabian and Ibn Bajjan end of the spectrum, he also draws on Ibn Sina, and particularly in the context of the more experiential striving after some measure of divine knowledge, he draws on Sufi strands in Ibn Sina's writings. So one actually finds elements of Sufi discourse in certain parts of his writings that it seems to be coming via Ibn Sina. And he really articulated a systematic philosophical conception of Jewish thought and religion and practice. And that became very much dominant, not only in the Islamic world, also in the Latin West. In certain contexts, in Provence, for example, it became very much dominant. But across the Islamic world, he really shaped all subsequent Jewish intellectual culture. And one can really see at least three distinct strands of Maimonidean, post-Maimonidean Jewish thought. In the Latin West, there's an Averroesian tendency. So they're drawing on Ibn Rushd, obviously in Hebrew transmission and partly in Latin transmission. And then they are drawing in Egypt and the Levant, there's a strong Sufi orientation and Avicenna and Sufi orientation side by side. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. And then in the Yemen, there's a synthesis with Ismaili and Neoplatonic, more broadly Neoplatonic and Hermetic thought with Maimonidean thought. So they're reading Maimonides, but they're also engaging directly with corpora of Islamic literature and synthesizing them and articulating a philosophical understanding of Jewish thought and practice, and in all of these genres, in monographs, in commentaries, in a range of different works, and drawing on these distinct intellectual traditions. Slide. So now we can zoom in and focus on where the most direct engagement with Sufi thought and practice occurs, and that's in Egypt and the Levant. So Bilad Sham and Egypt, and it really begins in Egypt, and the first great leader of what it at least emerges as a Jewish Sufi movement is Avraham ben Moshe Maimonides, Ibn Maimoni, and he is the son, the only son of Moses Maimonides, and he was associated with an older contemporary by the name of Avraham HaHasid, Abraham the Pious, who promoted Sufi thought and practice among the Jews of Egypt. He appears to have written a Sufi commentary on the Song of Songs, or rather, a judeo-arabic commentary on the Song of Songs, which is deeply shaped by Sufi discourse, in which he speaks about sort of erotic love for the divine, seeking, unveiling. The various figures of the Song of Songs become figures for aspects of direct religious experience, direct spiritual experience, and they're framed very much in Sufi terms. He's quoted quite widely by Abraham Maimonides in the fragments of his one of his two surviving major works, but they're all in a fragmentary state. So his magnum opus, his major work was Kitab Kifayat al-Abidin, the sufficient work for God's devout servants, and it's written after the fashion of a Sufi manual. At least one of the major surviving fragments is, and he draws very explicitly and very consciously on Sufi thought and practice. So some well-known examples include the adoption of the khirqa, conveyed by the master, by the sheikh, upon the disciple, and we'll see a short text about that. and references to ritual use of music, and encouraging night vigils and regular fasting. So here is a short excerpt in the translation of Samuel Rosenblatt from his translation Highways to Perfection. And so Abraham Maimonides writes as follows. I hope you'll pardon the archaic English. We'll manage. It's probably the archaic English is probably more of a challenge than the original Arabic, which I probably should have brought instead. But thou knowest also that which is prevalent among those Sufis of Islam, among whom there is prevalent of the ways of the early saints of Israel, what is not prevalent, or is but little prevalent, among our contemporaries, namely that the master attire the novice in the khirqa as the latter is about to enter his course and pursue it. There's a lot to unpack here. But the first thing is that he's very consciously looking to Sufi practice and adopting an aspect of Sufi practice. The second thing is that he's framing this as one of the ways of the early saints of Israel. So he actually finds a biblical precedent for the bestowing of the khirqa, which is the prophet Elijah spreads his cloak upon Elisha, his successor, and he interprets that as the bestowal of a khirqa. And the third thing that we can note is that it is not prevalent or but little prevalent among his contemporaries. What does that mean? It seems quite clear that what it means is it is prevalent in his circle. It exists in his circle. He actually has a circle of followers around him. And we know that he also convened his own prayer quorum, his own minyan, prayers in his private residence, where he adopted various aspects of Islamic ritual practice. So, for example, full we call it genuflection, I believe. Is that correct? Fuller prostration in prayer, which was not the dominant practice and remains not the dominant practice among rabbinic Jews, and also that the seating and aesthetics of the synagogue were very much modeled on the mosque. And he discusses that in another part of Kitab Kifayat al-Abidin. And so it seems that he actually established a circle around him of followers where they adopted these practices, including, I think, fairly strongly implicitly, the bestowing of the khirqa. And so we're going to skip some time. I think that the existence of a Jewish Sufi movement, or rather a group of people that self-identified as Hasidim, as pietists, and modeled their practice quite consciously and directly on Sufi practice in the lifetime of Abraham Maimonides is very well established. I will refer to a book at this point, which is Judaism, Sufism, and the Pietists of Medieval Egypt by Alicia Russ Fishbane. And that's an excellent study of that movement in the time of Abraham Maimonides. The extent to which that movement continues in a centralized or institutionalized way beyond the lifetime of Abraham Maimonides, I have to confess, I'm not certain of that. I'm not certain of the extent to which we can speak of a continuity of a movement beyond his generation. However, we can certainly speak about an intellectual trend and an intellectual culture. And I think that can demonstrably be shown to continue well beyond the period of his activity. So we'll look at Tanhum ben Yosef HaYerushalmi. As you heard, I wrote a book about this chap, and he was possibly a native of Jerusalem. He certainly lived there for some period and left against his will. And he lived most of his life in Fustat. and he died there in 1291 after hearing the news of the Mamluk conquest of Crusader Acre and the massacre of the Jewish sages of Acre. He died, according to his son, implicitly, I think, of shock from the news. But he was primarily a philologist, and he authored heavily linguistic commentaries on much of the Hebrew Bible and a dictionary of Rabbinic Hebrew. And these are all fascinating literary works, but they don't have much to do with Sufism. However, in a number of his introductions to his biblical works, he advocates Sufi ideas and practices, and they do find their way into his philosophical commentaries. So most of his commentaries are philological. But for example, the Song of Songs is understood to be some kind of an allegory. And so there he can really go wild and let loose and share a bit more of his personality and his personal interests, and it becomes heavily Sufi in its in a lot of its terminology, and in a lot of the practices that he advocates, sometimes implicitly and sometimes explicitly. By the way, here on the right is an image of one of the manuscripts of his work. It's not unfortunately an autograph. There are autographs of his works, and they look very messy. But this is a nice, attractive manuscript of his work in Judeo-Arabic. So you can see it's in Hebrew script, but it's the lemmas from the text. This is actually from Ecclesiastes. And the lemmas are in Hebrew, but the commentary is all in Arabic. So we'll have a look at this. And I might have to move this around to be able to read it. Okay, so this is from his commentary on the Song of Songs, and he writes as follows: there is a verse which is repeated 3 times, which is an oath, where the daughters of Jerusalem are adjured not to arouse love until it desires, whatever that means. And it appears in more or less the same form 3 times, and a 4th time in a slightly different form. But he notices that this appears 3 times, and he says the first time that it appears, he says that these correspond with 3 stations, 3 maqamat, and he writes as follows: the scholars who are acquainted with these stations, maqamat, and know their ranks and purposes say, the journey may be divided into 3 parts: a journey to God, safar ilallah, which is asceticism and exercises and struggles; a journey with God, safar ma'allah, which is worship and fasting and constant seeking of God; and a journey within God, which is the attainment and immersion in love of him in pure knowledge. No trace of any other beings remains in the soul, only of him praised is he, to the point that the soul disregards its own essence and is not aware of its own existence as a result of the sheer strength of its preoccupation with his love. This is true peace, which is neither, so you can really see here the quality of Judeo-Arabic. This is true peace, ash-shalom al-haqiqi, which neither changes nor fades. And may he grant you peace. Oh, because he intersperses this with the priestly blessing, the 3-fold priestly blessing of the Torah. And may he grant you peace. Similarly, he stated concerning the final rank and the last of the stations, then I became in his eyes as one who finds peace. That's a verse from the Song of Songs. Now, what he's actually doing here is quite fascinating. Firstly, he's writing a biblical commentary. It's very, very clearly a Jewish commentary on Hebrew text. He draws on Hebrew language and biblical and rabbinic sources very freely. But he is interpreting the text, and it's what he sees to be its 3-fold structure through this prism of 3 maqamat, of some kind of concept of spiritual progression, which is framed in Sufi terminology that he can also get through the peripatetic tradition. He can also get this through Ibn Sina, and I believe that he does. By the way, I actually believe that most of the description of these practices here comes from Al-Isharat wa Tanbihat, the section Fi Maqamat al-Arifin. However, he also cites this concept of a threefold spiritual journey, and that is more directly and unambiguously Sufi. And I also believe that this was that he probably encountered this as an oral tradition, because although there's a formulation very much like this, I mean, there are many sayings about spiritual journeying, about safar, and there are many, but in this kind of way, a typology of journeying rather than the journeyers, and the specific way that it's framed, there's a fairly close parallel to a passage in Ibn al-Arabi, but it's actually closest to some later formulations in the Akbarian tradition, which I actually didn't make sure that I have handy here, which I apologize for. But some of the closest formulations actually post-date Tanhum. And I suspect that that's because it's circulating orally. I suspect that once this is circulating in those sources, in those circles, that it's sort of simplified, it's crisp, it's nice, and it circulates among Sufis. And I believe that Tanhum had direct contact with Sufis, and that this was most probably where he got some of this material. He also speaks about al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human being, but his conception of the perfect human being, although he uses it as a technical term, and he seems to be drawing that again from Sufi sources, he the way that he frames that, the way that he understands that, is basically a philosophical concept of self-perfection. It's a philosophical perfectionism, which but framed in Sufi terms, which is particularly interesting because Ibn al-Arabi's reformulation of his adoption of that terminology of human perfection is a sort of a subversion of philosophical discourse, where human perfection was a standard topic of discourse, and he sort of adopted that and framed it in very new terms. And here we have basically an Avicennan writer adopting the Sufi terminology, again now from Sufi sources, but reframing it in Avicennan philosophical terms, which I think is lovely, and we'll see that actually that discourse of al-insan al-kamil continued at a later stage in these Judeo-Arabic sources. So now we are going to meet the last traceable descendant of Moses Maimonides, David ben Yehoshua Maimoni. And he composed biblical commentaries on Maimonides' legal code, and he also composed a Sufi style manual entitled Al-Murshid ila Tafarrud, the Guide to Solitude, and a magnum opus entitled Tajrid al-Haqa'iq, which survives in multiple manuscript fragments, and it's never been edited, published, or studied. Its chapter headings have been translated and included in one study that I'm aware of, and also in a Hebrew language study, and in the introduction to the edition of Al-Murshid ila Tafarrud. But it's really beyond chapter headings. It's never been studied. Now, in the Murshid, he presents his vision of the way of piety, derech ha-hasidut, and he uses the Hebrew terminology, which echoes again what we saw right at the beginning of the Jewish Sufi, the emergence of some Jewish engagement with Sufism, with the figure of Avraham HaChassid, Abraham the Pious. He talks about Asuluk fi derech Hashem, traveling the path of the Lord, right? Which is immediately reminiscent of the Arabic, not reminiscent. It's a translation of the Arabic formula Asuluk fi tariq Allah, which so it's he. So there is a tendency to basically adopt Sufi terminology that's very recognizably Sufi terminology, and to find Hebrew equivalents or reformulate that in Hebrew to somehow convert it, as it were, to Judaism. So his definition of the way of piety includes a threefold definition of the pietist and a complex. So I'll actually say a word about that, of the pietist, the Hasid. So this is the pietist, who is described as firstly somebody who perfects their akhlaq, their ethical dispositions. Secondly, somebody who despises all things other than the beloved, because there is also a negative sense of that, of the verbal root het samech dalet in Hebrew, which it's a rarer form, but it's a rarer term, but it has a negative sense as well. And he says that is somebody who despises everything in the world except for the beloved. And then thirdly, he takes the terminology of a hasidah, a stork, which is a loner. The stork is a loner, as the bird is a loner. It dwells alone, and he says that is the true meaning of the hasid, of the pietist, somebody who dwells alone in solitude. And the term that they use across this literature for solitude is khalwa, and it appears that actually goes all the way back to Bahya ibn Pakuda, who adopted that term and concept and practice of solitude in a very serious way. It was continued by Maimonides and very much developed in the post-Maimonidean context in Egypt and Levant. So he also he creates this typology contrasting the Hasid with the Hacham, the pietist with the sage or scholar. Now, if you look at this passage where he organizes this into 8 ranks, it is a straight cut and paste from Suhrawardi al-Maqtul. It's straight from Hikmat al-Ishraq and slightly reworked with Hebrew terminology. So the technical terms that he uses are Hebrew, but all of his definition and arrangement is based very directly on a Suhrawardi. And here he frames as the ideal that one engages in bahth, in philosophical, scientific investigation, discursive investigation, and ta'alluh and istishraq. So divinization, the quest for divinization, and seeking illumination, which is understood in the illuminationist tradition as an intuitive knowledge that one gains through spiritual training. So David Ben Yehoshua arranges classical rabbinic sources into a progression of spiritual stations, again maqamat, and they culminate in wusul, in arrival or union with the beloved. This is also common to all of the previous Judeo-Arabic writers in this milieu that we mentioned. They all use this terminology. And he describes Moses as the most comprehensive and perfected human being who contains the full range of spiritual virtues. That might sound familiar from, for example, I mean, I'm sure it has a richer history than this, but Ibn al-Arabi's conception of the Prophet Muhammad as containing the full range of divine modalities. And so in his Tajreed, which, as I mentioned, is unedited, unpublished, and unstudied, he describes the maximally perfected human individual as the perfect human, as al-insan al-kamil, and that's the topic of a chapter. After he discusses sort of the path to human perfection, he discusses this figure of the maximally perfected human being, al-insan al-kamil. So let's take a step back.
Raf,
And
would it be possible to maybe finish in a few minutes? I'm sorry
certainly,
for giving you a heads up.
No, we're right at the end. It's great.
Excellent.
It's great time.
Sorry.
So we'll take one step back and talk about some of the characteristics of this intellectual milieu, of this particular intellectual culture in this period. So that is Jewish intellectual culture in the medieval Egypt and the Levant, right? In this period, from about 1200 to 1500. Firstly, there is an ongoing engagement with the peripatetic or neo-Aristotelian philosophical tradition, and that's via the works of Maimonides and Ibn Sina in particular. Now, we see that they cite Al-Farabi and they cite all kinds of people, but there's no doubt that Ibn Sina is really central. He's very widely cited, and Maimonides remains really central as well. And they're all engaging with that literature. So in that way, it really sits within the peripatetic tradition as well. But their interpretation of those works is informed by an engagement with Sufi thought and practice, and that is both via literary sources and direct interactions. Beyond the literary evidence in some of these works of what look like direct contact, there's a lot of additional evidence for this sort of thing. So, for example, the 40-day retreat, Al-Arba'in or Al-Arba'iniya, is described in correspondences between Jews that they participated in this. So Jews actually adopted this as a practice. There's I didn't mention also that David ben Yehoshua also talks about contemplation of colors, the appropriate dress, sort of simple attire for the pietist, and also the use of music to attain spiritual states. And there's also an awareness of the Ishraqi tradition, which appears in many different sources from that period to different degrees. I've probably seen that the most in David ben Yehoshua, but I think there's evidence for that in other writers, for example, Tanchum Yerushalmi and others. And so those traditions, combined with the shared pietistic praxis that's largely drawn from Sufism, constituted a unique common Jewish Islamic intellectual and spiritual culture during this period. I think that I'm currently working on, as Aydoğan is very much aware, we're working together on this particular work, which is a Muslim commentary on Maimonides' legal code on the philosophical sections, and there's a lot of evidence within that of direct collaboration between David ben Yehoshua and this Muslim writer, Ala ad-Din al-Muwaqit, who seems to have, they really seem to have collaborated directly. And I think we can really point to a common intellectual culture during this period. And it's very deeply shaped by all of those traditions. But what makes it, I think, the most unique regional intellectual culture is its engagement with the Sufi tradition, openly and self-consciously, to the extent that Jewish pietism or piety was gauged by the extent of one's adoption of a lot of those practices, which were recognized as Sufi practices. I don't believe there's another time in Jewish history where one was considered a maximally pious Jew via one's engagement with the neighboring dominant non-Jewish spiritual tradition. So that makes this period of about 300 years a really unique and interesting period to study. And it came to an end with the Spanish expulsion. It was really the waves of exiles from Christian Spain settling in the Eastern Mediterranean around the Middle East that very quickly transformed Jewish linguistic culture, literary culture, spiritual culture, intellectual culture very rapidly in the wake of those events. And so it declined and it was lost, but it's now being gradually recovered, and it's a fascinating chapter of human history to study. Thank you.